All right, hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about the Lasarowitz article, the interpretive communities article, if you want to think of it that way. Some of our other articles have focused on political orientations. We've got one coming up on the emotions. This one is about interpretive communities, which connects us back to a theme from our course, the discourse communities, public sphere, these types of things, right? So I'm not going to go through the whole article. I'm just going to give you the highlights and kind of norm so you can see, was I reading this thing the way that Dr. Cohen wanted me to read this? I'm sure you were. But let's go over a few things anyway. So as I said, the relationship to our course, this article discusses communities, but hopefully you're asking yourself, how is this different than discourse communities? It is in a slightly different way. The communities in this article are sort of happenstance communities. They're not groups of people that know each other or even see themselves as necessarily linked, but rather they are groups of people that have the same beliefs and attitudes. And as researchers of how people think and get their beliefs and attitudes and how we might persuade them, if we were those researchers, and we kind of are in this course, we would gather up these beliefs and attitudes and say, okay, these people are our group. They're all the same. They've all got the same biases and dispositions and responses and reactions. And so this is what makes them a community inside of this article, right? Which is different than a discourse community or a public, which is very intentional. And the people know they are the same, whether it's based on their identity or on the issue that they're trying to promote and shape the world in their favor in. So a little bit different idea of community, but nonetheless beliefs and attitudes, which are the drivers of any community, whether it's sort of happenstance or whether it's very, very intentional. All right, so moving on from there. What can we learn about people's beliefs and changing their behavior? Well, I think the biggest thing is the list of 5 strategies at the end, but there's some good stuff along the way. If we think of the issue of climate change, which centers this article and kind of centers our course as well, just to give us a way to connect all of this theory together and turn it into something useful and exemplify it. We might ask ourselves, well, why are such a large majority of Americans concerned, yet they rank the issue so low? 70 to 80% of Americans are worried about climate change, but nobody's really doing anything. They're not changing their behaviors. Well, we learn a lot about not just climate change or how to change climate change, reduce climate change, but rather what is it that changes people's minds and makes them act? That's the bigger thing that we can learn by looking into this. And so we see a few things that come out of this article. They are representative of things that we've seen before, but repetition is good, and we might get a few new things too. One, changing people's behavior may require an immediate risk. Okay, so some sort of threat or risk is really, really important, and it needs to be immediate, not too far in the future. And then perhaps people will change their mind. Next, something we've talked about before, scientific technical descriptions. This would involve lots of logic, logos, so to speak. Not necessarily effective, even if they're targeting threat and risk and danger, but rather the social and psychological factors, people's perceptions, how you introduce an idea to people become very, very important too. Another big idea in this article is the idea of threat and fear versus shame and guilt. We've talked about negative emotions, but they're not all the same. Threat and fear seem to be very, very persuasive. Shame and guilt less so, as we've read in the past. True, they're all negative, but shame and guilt, as we learned in the past, suggest some people aren't acting properly, and that can make people defensive. They try to justify the way they live or what they believe, their attitudes and beliefs, and they don't change their behavior. We also found out that shame and guilt can be overwhelming, and therefore the degree of change required to live unshamefully is too much. It's too great. They simply feel they can't do it, and they do nothing to change their behavior. That is, of course, completely different. We could think of this as internal, right, versus threat and fear, which seem negative but are external. There's this thing going on in the environment, in the world, right? And that's the reason to change. And there's no shame or guilt. It's rather this thing is going to happen unless you do something to prevent it. And you don't have to necessarily trigger shame and guilt to use these. So these seem to be the more effective negative frameworks, so to speak. But what are threat and fear based on? They have to be immediate, they have to be local, and they have to affect humans, right? We see that in the research from climate change. We see then why the polar bear icon is kind of a failure. It's neither human nor local nor immediate. It has none of the things that we want, right? And yet this is what most people thought of, as we learned in the article, when people thought of climate change and the effects of climate change. No wonder no one is doing anything. This was a poor choice from the start. start. So whatever marketing strategy chose this, whatever public communication house chose this, however this happened, it was a really, really bad idea, right? Few other things that we can think of. Different communities have different perceptions of risk, so you've got to tailor your message to them, right? You've got to match people's beliefs and attitudes and then try to undo those, try to figure out what their threat or their fear is, what their threat or fear level is as well, and then adjust to that. Maybe one way to talk about this in an interesting manner is to look at one group, the naysayer group, which is a very different group in terms of their environmental climate change beliefs. We remember this group was here. You remember this group is identified by being white, male, politically conservative, holding pro-individualism, pro-hierarchism, and anti-egalitarian views, anti-environmental attitudes, distrustful of institutions, very religious. And radio as well. So that's a lot. We know a lot about them. What we would ask ourselves, of course, is, well, and I actually jotted this down in the question, so I'm hoping you were thinking of this. Which one of these, if you had to persuade them to believe in climate change, which ones would probably be the best? And so we can think about that. Religion, potentially, right, I think is one. You know, religion asks us to take care of the earth. We are the stewards of the earth, right? Actually, some religions that have a pro-environmental attitude use that. That might be one way in that doesn't tread too much upon their other values. In fact, if they're pro-hierarchism, God is the top of the hierarchy, right? Many religious people are conservative and have a pro-hierarchical view of life. Then, if you can trigger religion, you're also triggering their need, the respect for hierarchy. We're drawn here back into what we learned from the TED Talks. Remember, conservatives value these things: loyalty, patriotism, respect for authority, and purity, sanctity, right? And so you might start to use these qualities, which we start to see elements of as we look through here. There are a few other things that don't have to do with those anti-egalitarian values. A distrust of most institutions. Those things really don't align with anything else, but if we wanted to use those as rhetorical strategies, I can say that, well, I'm not going to say that they should support the government fixing this because they're distrustful of most institutions. Nor should I probably argue it's good for everybody because they are pro-individualism and anti-egalitarianism. I might argue that it's good for them to get ahead, right? Fixing climate change will help you get ahead. Is it good for everybody? Well, it doesn't matter to them, so maybe I wouldn't bring that up so much. But it's good for everybody arguments won't work with this group, but it's good for them in some way, along with somebody that's higher on the hierarchy than them would want them to take care of nature. Might be my best shot at doing that. And who should fix it? Definitely not institutions. Either capitalism, I would suggest, or otherwise simply not the government. So we can see now where if we put together some of these traits, we use these traits as rhetorical frameworks in the ways I just suggested for our language choice, and we think back on what we saw from the TED Talks videos and the examples there, I've got a really, really rich palette now to choose language from, to choose frameworks from, to try to convince this particular group of people. It is my best shot. I know a lot about them. I know what they respect. I know what likely persuades them. I've tapped into their values. And just maybe I can open their ears despite the fact that they are a highly anti-environmental group. Right? And so this is where our course becomes interesting. Now, does all this give you the language? No, but we're all smart people and we can find the language to do these things. We know who should fix things, who should not fix things, and what types of metaphors, personifications, institutions, etc. we should use. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning is I jotted down some potential answers to what I just talked about here, and we can learn one big thing. Sometimes good, effective rhetoric is knowing what not to say. That can be just as effective. The other thing we can do is we can see a bit of dystopian apocalyptic coming in here, and maybe we have yet another answer in our course to how to use this. And the answer here seems to be that because most people's beliefs aligned with those of the alarmists, although the alarmists were higher, a little bit of apocalyptic dystopian rhetoric, if it's immediate and human-based, might not be bad. We're back to threat, right? We're back to danger, which is the very, very thing that this article tackles so well. So maybe we have an answer here. We need a threat that's fairly immediate, human-based, and local, and then we get somewhere. Okay, so what are our 5 strategies? These are the big takeaways, the things that you can remember probably forever and ever, now that we have the context to pull these out of. Highlight past and potential local regional problems and changes. Highlight that the problem is happening now. Highlight the impacts on human health and society's well-being. You can discuss the remaining uncertainties. That's the ethical thing to do. It is risky. Some people take advantage of the uncertainty if you were debating in public, so you'd want to be careful there. And you need to tailor the messages to particular communities, as we just did with the naysayers. And we said, all right, what are we going to avoid? What should we bring up? Might be completely different than a talk you'd give to a different group. All right, for fun, we're going to look at some climate change posters that I pulled off of the internet and just evaluate them quickly. Check out this one. Human change, not climate change. Well, it's tapping into the human, which we know is important. We don't see any threat. We don't see any danger. We don't see any particular locality here. We don't know that it's an immediate danger. We don't even see it affecting people. Instead, it looks like we have little wind turbines here for eyes and stuff like this. So this is probably not going to be very effective. It seems to miss most of those things that we just learned about in the article. This one clearly doing the same thing. There's absolutely nothing in this one to persuade us. Now, these might be helpful, as we learned in the past, to maintain membership for a pro-environmental community or public, but this is doing nothing to change people's minds, at least according to the research, right? Here's a few more. A small change can make a big difference. Got a cute little mouse making a tree here. But this, again, there's no threat. There's no danger. There's nothing immediate about it. There's nothing local about it. There's nothing even human about it. So none of these work. This one here, we kind of get to the human. You can see this is supposed to be ecological collapse. It's the domino effect, right? And we see humankind falling last here. But that one's fairly abstract, and I would imagine that people would have problems understanding what this one is. You're just going to kind of walk right by it if it's a poster, and that's a problem. And also, of course, it's decontextualized. There's no local problem here. The fear and the threat isn't incredibly high because of the affective imagery. Remember, the article talked about affective imagery, and that could be captured in language too. So, Silent Spring probably does a pretty good job with affective imagery. It uses its language to create a Silent Spring, a world where everything is dying. So affective imagery can be photos, and that would probably be best, but it doesn't need to be that necessarily. But you can see the affective imagery here is really, really low, and there's no use of language to punctuate that. Or strengthen it in any way. So these are all fairly ineffective messages. If we look a little bit farther, maybe we can look at this one real quick. Now it looks like we have some local images. This is probably what we're talking about here. I see people affected, houses affected. We don't actually see people in here, but clearly this is going to affect people. So this is the present. It's immediate. It's local. We don't really quite see people, but they're implied here. So this one's probably better. This is probably the best we've got out of all these that we've looked at so far. The other half of it, though, this is all one campaign poster. This one probably not so effective right here. It's ignoring some of these things and probably makes it seem pretty easy that we can just flip a switch on the planet, and it doesn't quite work like that. If we look at other things, there's no how-tos. How can I control climate change? Remember, people need to be told what to do. Might lead to people being overwhelmed. So although it makes us pay attention, I don't know how to change my behavior. There's no how-tos here, so this is fairly ineffective. So this does half of the job, but doesn't really finish it. And so if we think about this as a structure for your paper, you won't be working in imagery necessarily, but you can see how your paper would want to do the local, the immediate, the human, that this does so well. But your paper also needs to provide some how-tos. What can people do in their daily life in order to change? And this poster fails on that level. If we wanted to switch topics momentarily and go to mental health, another social problem, you can see here, of course, it's much more immediate. Climate change we can't see in mental health. We can see also, it is kind of invisible, but we know that it affects people every day, right? And we can see that these posters here are targeting that. It's time to have a talk about mental illness in young people, right? We can see that it affects all different types of people. We can't see how it affects them necessarily, but we know that it does affect them, and they're saying this. So these, and it might be the topic that lends itself to the immediate, the local, the human, much more than the environment does. So they're going to have an easier time using these strategies, but we can see they are using them, and this is pretty good. If we wanted to critique this a bit, we might say there's no how-tos offered. How should I talk to people? How should I approach people? Something like this. And we don't see them highly affected. This one here, Meet Susan. She looks more affected. So we can think about that. That applies a few more of the concepts. But in general, some issues might have an easier time applying these concepts. I'll leave you with this. This is a page on water rights and that everybody deserves clean drinking water. As we look at this, they're making an argument as to why everybody needs clean drinking water. You see the local, you see the human, you see all the things that are persuasive, but one thing you don't see is threat or risk. And if people are going to lose something, you probably want to argue with threat.